Hi, welcome back, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the second session in the Senior Leader Series, titled Environment and Leadership. I think it could equally be titled Planning and Leadership as well. I did want to keep the theme of environment going throughout the two sessions. Today, again, plenty of opportunities for reflections. It's going to be a little bit more information heavy, particularly as we move towards the end of the session as well. But please feel free to stop, start whenever you'd like to. If you want to take down some notes, if you want to do some reflection exercises yourself, if you found them helpful, please absolutely feel free to do so. Okay, so again, my name's Kwame. I'm here today with the Black Curriculum and DARPL, and I really hope that you enjoyed today's session. Hope that you find it useful. So jumping straight in, let's just start with a little reflection on what's happened since the last session, okay? Progress and impact, right? It may well be that the last session was just yesterday. So if that's the case, that's fine. Maybe you can, rather than talking about something material, you can talk about your thoughts, right? Something immaterial, your thoughts, the conversations that you've been having, so on and so forth. So what we'll do then in that case is we'll start off with just some nice and simple questions. Maybe take 5 minutes just to reflect on these questions and write down some answers. If you don't have a pen and paper together already, maybe it's best to just go and grab one now. As I said, there will be a few moments where you are going to be writing some things down. So feel free to pause the video now and go and grab a pen and paper. And for those of you that do have a pen and paper right now, or for those of you that have come back, I think what we'll do is we'll start with some nice simple questions. So what has changed since the last session? Okay, what has changed? For you as an individual, for your teaching, and also for your students. Okay, so we'll go through each of those questions. Take about 5 minutes or so just to write some of those answers down. Again, doesn't necessarily have to be material. It could be wider reflections. It could be conversations that you've had with your students and so on and so forth. The key thing here is just thinking about the continuity of last session, right? Or kind of the way in which maybe, and hopefully last session brought up some wider reflections around anti-racist action and anti-racist education. Okay, so if you haven't already paused now, I say pause it now. For those of you that are back, let's move on to the next part of today's session. And we're gonna go straight away again with another reflection task. So world history, okay? The question is who learned world history at school? Okay, who learned world history at school? And also, what did you learn? So please write these questions down. Maybe go back and answer these questions, kind of one by one. But really, I want you to think about what did you learn about world history in school, and how was it taught? Yeah. And once you've completed those, the final question: what was missing that you now know and feel was important? Okay, what was missing that you now know and feel was important? Yeah. So we'll pause the video now, maybe take about five minutes just to write down our thoughts. And again, they don't have to be perfect. This is just more of a reflective exercise, an exercise in critical thought and really engaging with our own educational experiences, right? What we ourselves were taught about the world. So we'll pause now and we'll come back and continue with the rest of the session in a second. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So hopefully you have some reflective thoughts down on world history, what you were taught, how it was taught, what was missing that you now feel is important. And really what this is about us getting to understand and know the world a little bit better, right? And of course, education is on a spectrum or it changes, right? Historically, depending on who's in power, the government, what they believe to be the primary mode or function of education, right? What they think society needs to get out of education. So of course, depending on where we go, we're always going to see different patterns in what we learn and how it's taught as well. So Again, another reflection exercise that I want us to do, just to think about being within the school, right? Being within the schools, and sometimes the ways in which racism can impact us psychologically. Is let's just take a little moment to reflect on these four questions. Okay. We'll reflect on these four questions. Please feel free to write down a paragraph. It would be great if you can write some reflections down to these. But can you think about a time when you felt wrongly judged, or a time when someone made you feel that that you did not belong to a group? Okay, these can be any examples. Okay, these can be examples in your personal life, in your professional life, anything that you so choose. Okay, and how did you feel? Were you able to move forward? What helped you reframe that moment and move forward? Second question, how has power and privilege affected you? Okay, and I will say, I think the way that the question is framed, it makes it seem like you are the one holding power and you are the one holding privilege, right? I just want to highlight, doesn't necessarily have to be the case, okay? It doesn't, the answer to the question doesn't have to be like power and privilege has benefited me in such and such way, which I think sometimes might be the go-to for some people reading that question. You can also think about it as how has power and privilege affected you, i.e., disenfranchised you, right? Or benefited you, okay? So please feel free to choose one or the other. The main point here is we're thinking about the ways in which power and certain forms of privilege, right, affect and impact people's daily lives. That's the main thing. It's just applying some critical thought to these scenarios, okay? And do any pieces of these conversations make you feel uncomfortable or not ready? Now, this final question is really a question to think about. Remember in the last session, we were talking about racial literacy, okay? So this question is framed around racial literacy in many ways, in the sense where it acknowledges that when we begin talking about something that we're not very used to talking about it, if we don't feel well equipped to deal with it, if we don't have the language to deal with it, we can sometimes feel uncomfortable or out of our depth, right? I'm sure we've all been there, talking amongst a group of people that maybe we've just met, they're all having a conversation about something, you really want to get involved, but you just don't feel equipped enough. Okay, I definitely myself have been there, right? So this question is really just to gauge where you feel you're at in your journey of racial literacy, and also to acknowledge that there's a lot of uncomfortability that comes with learning something new, okay? To learn something new, we have to go through an uncomfortable stage, right? We have to go through that uncomfortable stage where it's not quite there before everything comes together and kind of reshapes or brings forth different perspectives, yeah? So we'll take a moment to write down some of those reflections. I think maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes, and I'll pause it there. You can pause everything now, and then we'll come back in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope that session was, or that exercise was useful. If you didn't manage to get through it all, that's absolutely fine. You can come back to it a little bit later, maybe after the session has finished. You can come back to it in your own time. It could just be a little reflective exercise. That's absolutely fine, okay? So I think what I wanted us to talk about first and foremost was audits, right? And audit outcomes and audit culture. Now, audits are incredibly useful to gauge something, right? To track something, incredibly useful tool. They do sometimes have, especially within the context of anti-racism, right? And I think in the context of any kind of major changes in policy or societal transitions, and they do have their disadvantages, and we will touch on that a little bit later. But for now, let's just focus primarily on audits, okay? So you've had your reflection. You've had your reflection on a few things now, and I think it's time for us to kind of move on to look at something in a little bit more detail. So this will be a part where I'm kind of going through some of the slides, talking in a little bit more detail, and we're going to start with racism in school settings, right? Racism in school settings may be expressed in many different ways, whether overt or covert. What do I mean by overt or covert? They may be implicit, right? Or they may be explicit, right? So it may be somebody shouting a name at somebody, bullying somebody, right? Or in other words, over, or it may be covert in the sense where it may be an example of quietly judging somebody, quietly excluding somebody, not necessarily talking to their racial background, or if they are, very, very quietly, not overly noticeable, right? Maybe done in private, okay? So knowing that racism can both be overt and covert, before we begin with the rest of the slides, let's just take one moment to list the possible ways in which racism may show up within your own school setting, okay? So let's just take a moment to list the possible ways in which racism may show up within your own school setting. Doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, right? But great for you to just reflect on the different spaces that it can come from, the different ways in which it can show up, especially for later when you're designing or improving your anti-racist plan, improving your policy, thinking about how you can get the whole school community engaged in this. This will definitely be a great resource for you to come back to. So we'll pause the video now. I'll let you make your list, and then I'll show you the list that I've also got, and we can compare and contrast, okay? Thank you, everybody. Okay, everybody, welcome back. So hopefully by now you've had the opportunity to write down a little list. Doesn't matter if it's big or small, it's absolutely fine. The main thing is that we're reflecting and thinking about these questions and acting on those thoughts, right? Writing them down, getting those thoughts down on paper. So I'll also take you through the list that we have. So what did you have, right? You can maybe tick it off if you got the same thing. Again, there's no right or wrong. There's some things on here that aren't necessarily, there might be some missing items on this list as well, right? And I think that's the main thing to remember, is that it takes the shape of the environment. It is reactive, it is responsive, right? And it's not always a one-size-fits-all approach. So in many ways, it's important to be conscious of that. But it can take the form of physical assault, of course, against a person or group because of their color, ethnicity, or nationality. Okay? Very, very important. I would also add religion to that one as well. I think in today's world, increasingly, various religious groups are also becoming the target of racist attacks. One that's not spoken about as much, I know, as recently there was some policy that came out by the Labour government, is Islamophobia, okay? And the way in which there is an explicit targeting of people of the Islamic faith, right? As being racialized, as being somehow less civilized, as people of as other people of Christian faith and so on and so forth. Thinking about this within the context of how race functions is also really important. So I think we could also add religion to that group there, okay? The use of derogatory names, insults, and racist jokes, of course, racist graffiti, provocative behaviors such as wearing racist badges or insignia, bringing racist materials into the school, verbal abuse and threats, incitement of others to behave in a racist way. And that can include physical assault. Okay, I remember when I was at school, I remember that people would, unfortunately, try and pressure other people to come and, call me names or beat me up because they themselves didn't want to do it. They didn't want to get into trouble, but they wanted it to be done. So also thinking about maybe the ways if people are getting in, if there's a fight and it's two people that you wouldn't necessarily expect it from, right? Thinking about the incitement of others to behave in a racist way is also a very important one. Racist comments in the course of discussion, of course, very important. Attempts to recruit others to racist organizations and groups. Okay, again, some more extreme examples, however, not so extreme. There is a really great Channel 4 documentary, Undercover in the Far Right. I would highly recommend. It was done by Hope Not Hate, and it was an investigation where a gentleman went undercover for 2 years in a far right organization. I'd highly recommend watching it. It's very shocking, very surprising to see the level of organization that is taking place within these groups. Not saying that that's necessarily happening in the school, but I think it's definitely interesting to think about the dedication and the organizational structures that go into developing racist and in the case of Hope Not Hate, far right extremist groups who are overtly racist and spouting kind of eugenics, racist scientific viewpoints. And in today's world, also increasingly, social media plays a massive role in that as well. Okay, ridicule and exclusion of an individual for cultural difference, e.g., food, music, religion, dress. Okay, and of course, the color of another person's skin can be added to that as well. Difference here is loose and also very important to consider. Okay, so for food, music, religion, dress, the way that somebody looks, the color of their skin, the hairstyles that they have, right? All of these can be inclusive. Refusal to cooperate with other people because of their color, ethnic origin, or nationality. There we go. And I think we can also add religion to that one as well there, okay? Written derogatory remarks, any of the above forms of racial harassment or any other discrimination by employers in connection with work placements or work experience. So, what procedures do you have in place to report and record racist incidents, okay? Some of the things that you might want to consider when doing this quick reflective exercise is how can you support the young person? Okay, what was the behavior of the young person or the multiple young people involved? What impact did it have, right? Both on the individual, on you, on the wider school culture, on the classroom dynamics, right? Thinking about racism not just as impacting two people, the one that's being racist and the one that's receiving racist abuse. You also have to think about how does it impact the wider culture, if not of the school, of the immediate classroom, or of the peer group that was around when this was happening. Okay, how does it impact those power dynamics, right? Within, from a small friendship group, to a classroom, to a year group, to a whole school wide, okay? And thinking about racist incidents in this way is very useful, right? Because culture shifts and culture changes according to what's brought in, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's cool, what's not cool. So thinking about how racist incidents can influence wider school culture, right, down to the friendship group, to the school itself, is very important. What does the child or young person want to happen next? And what attitudes, prejudices, or other factors have influenced the behavior? And we can think about that both within the school, familial context, community context, but also increasingly the national context and the media, right? And going back to what I was saying before about social media as well, it's been reported numerous times the amount of racist material and misogynistic material that finds its way onto social media platforms today, targeting particularly young men, unfortunately. And so thinking about social media as well, I think is also really important. So let's take a moment for you guys to reflect on what procedures you do have in place to report and record racist incidents, okay? And then maybe you can think and use these considerations as a guide to anything that might be missing. So we'll pause for 5 minutes and then we'll come back. And yeah, thank you, everybody. Okay, everybody, welcome back. So hopefully you've had time to write those reflections down and thinking about kind of what your reporting procedures look like, how you might respond to racist incidents. And this brings me on to a really, really interesting paper by a researcher called Sarah Ahmed. Sarah Ahmed is a researcher that has written extensively on university policies and diversity policies within education, and has also done a lot of longer form work on kind of racist incidents and misogynistic incidents within, let's say, educational settings. Okay, really, really great author. Writes some very, very incredible stuff. Now, one of the papers that she's written that I'm citing here is called Doing the Document Instead of Doing the Doing. Okay, doing the document instead of doing the doing. And this, if you remember before, I was speaking around auditing and audit culture. Okay, and I was saying that audit culture is very useful in some ways, right? Because it helps us measure something, right? It helps us measure something. And what Sarah Ahmed says is she said, in the words of a practitioner that she was working with, she said, an audit can establish if we have gone through the process, right? But it can't really determine whether we are altering culture here. So we can say, okay, we've gone through the process of anti-racist action. We are now anti-racist. We are going to chart that and audit that, or we're auditing our materials for anti-racism. We're auditing our policies for anti-racism. So we've definitely gone through the process, but it can't determine whether you're changing the culture here. And that's really, really important. She says, a lot of the times from what she's seen in her research is that people end up doing the documents rather than doing the doing. What does she mean by that? She means that everybody rushes to get the policy done, right? They rush to have a mission statement out. They even make their website, and she says this in the paper, they even make their website look really nice and it's inclusive of all the different types of people that are at their school. They have a statement on their website, you know, we're committed to anti-racism. They do all of this. And they get the benefits of doing all of this, right? Because on paper, great, they're really taking this seriously. But when it comes to school-wide culture, nothing has changed. And that's not the fault of anybody. It's not intentional. But what happens is that the senior leaders, right, and the teaching staff, and that pouring all of their resources, time and energy, what little resources, time and energy they have left after their teaching and marking and all of this, into doing the document, getting the policy written, getting the website changed, getting the mission statement done, right? And they spend very little time on, if we think back to pedagogy, right, and environment and culture, they spend very little time on trying to actively change the overall culture of the schooling environment, right? Through supporting their peers, right? Through reflective sessions, through engaging with students, right? So the more immaterial parts of anti-racism, which are incredibly important, if not more important than the material components, right? The document itself, right? The doing, the sustained doing of anti-racist work that is intangible in many ways. She's saying that's the thing that everybody needs to be focusing on. The document is important, but what comes first is the doing, right? The making sure that everybody feels supported and everybody is working towards the creation of a shared anti-racist culture. Really, really interesting paper. As I said before, it's called Doing the Document Instead of Doing the Doing. Sarah Ahmed, 2007. I'd highly, highly, highly recommend going and taking a look at it. It's so dense, there's so much there, and I wish I could have put it all down, but this is something that has really stayed with me since reading it, and I found very, very important for us to discuss today as well. So as I said, auditing really has its benefits. If you fall into the trap of doing too much auditing, you leave culture by the wayside, right? The culture starts reducing. So you really want to be focusing on that culture, focusing on that environment, and then building up from there. And the document will come with that, okay? So a quick exercise then, in terms of doing the document or doing the doing, I want you to reflect on whether you have been doing the document or doing the doing, right? Normally I would ask for somebody to feedback, but obviously, of course, this is, everybody is kind of learning by themselves, so that's absolutely fine. But just take a few moments and be honest with yourself. There's no right or wrong answer here, right? The best part is just being honest. Do you feel like you've been doing the document or doing the doing? You might feel like you've been doing both, so that's absolutely fine. Do you feel like you're leaning more towards the document or leaning more towards the doing? If you were to split it down the middle, would it be 60% documents, 40% doing? Would it be 50-50? Would it be 70-30, 30-70? What does that look like for you? Okay, so just take 5 minutes to reflect on that. And again, these are really great resources for later when you come to do this work, when you come to with the rest of your team, in school-wide meetings and so on and so forth. This is material that you can really use for reflection and to kind of bring into the school culture. So we'll pause now and we'll come back in just a moment. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Now, what is this here, praxis? Now, the reason that I have praxis here is this was this is a kind of a theoretical concept that is used throughout. The first time I came to know this theoretical concept was through the educator Paulo Freire, who was, for those of you that don't know, I'm sure many of you do, I think he is canonical within education studies. Paulo Freire developed a framework as what he calls critical pedagogy, which is a framework for teaching people literacy skills, primarily in rural communities, rural farming communities, and tying that to their own lived experience of trying to improve their lived environment as well. Now, what Paulo Freire says is he brings forth this concept called praxis. Okay, and he says that praxis is essentially, there's 3 or 4 main stages to praxis, right? You begin with theory. Right? Theory helps us to read the world. Okay, it helps us to understand the world. Doesn't mean it's truth, but it is a hypothesis about why the world functions in the way that it does. You reflect on that theory and your immediate environment, right? You maybe think about how you want to try and change something, and then you come to action and you implement that. So you implement that knowledge that you have and that theoretical knowledge that you have, as well as that lived knowledge that you have, to try and create a remedy for a particular problem, and you put that into action. Once you've put that into action, you go into the next stage of reflection. Did that work? Did it not work? How might I improve it? Right? You go back to theory. Okay, well, what's this person saying about this? What's this person saying about this? Have they done something similar? Is there a different hypothesis that suits why everything is happening now, right? Why I'm seeing, in this instance, these various forms of racism now, okay? Then you go back to reflection and you go back to action, and it's a cycle. So really, when we think about doing the document and doing the doing, we have to think about them in relationship to one another. You can't just do the document and you can't just do the doing, okay? They need to be in relationship to one another, right? And they need to also be met with deeper reflection and kind of, let's say, the advancement of knowledge in many ways as well, right? Seeking out theories, seeking out what other educational practitioners are doing with a community of learners, right? The DARPL resources that are available, and maybe even the occasional article that you can find online, okay? And really just taking a holistic approach to changing your wider school culture as well. And this brings us to another really great concept by Sarah Ahmed, which is habitual worlds, okay? And the impact, and I'm saying the impact of an anti-racist institution. So Ahmed is a phenomenologist as well, and phenomenology really is just the study of phenomena or the study of experience, right? It's experiential, how we move through space, how we understand the world. And as I said, she works a lot on institutions and she works a lot on educational institutions as well. So I have this quote here that I found incredibly useful for thinking about school culture, also thinking about how the culture of an institution is made. And she says that public spaces take shape through the habitual actions of bodies, such that the contours of space itself, the contours of maybe the school, the contours of the public space, right? But I think in this sense, the contours of the school itself could be described as habitual, could be described as being made of the actions of the bodies that exist within that school. And she says, I turn to the concept of habits to theorize not so much how bodies acquire their shape, but how spaces, i.e. schools in this instance, acquire the shape of the bodies that inhabit them. Okay, and we can think about this in so many ways. We can think about this in ways of recruitment. As I mentioned before, we know that diverse recruitment improves creativity, it improves workplace cohesion and collaboration. Okay, let's also think about how does it shape and change the very fabric of the school itself. Okay, how does the individuals that we have within a room shape what is habitual in that environment, what is normal and what is not normal? So when we come to thinking about anti-racist institutions, we also have to think about how the bodies that are in the space, the people that are in the space, right, the habits of those people, right, the everyday actions of those people build and shape the overall schooling environment and the schooling experience for the students. And for yourselves as senior leaders, it's really, really great and important to think about these things and to think about how who you have passing through your halls, how you're teaching, right? The everyday actions that you're doing, the everyday reflections that you're doing can ultimately change the fabric and culture of the school. So thinking about that doing once again, right? And I think this is a great example of how small habits can impact, right? The doing that is the small habits can impact an overall school culture in a way that documents can't always do. And another thing that Sarah Ahmed is saying in doing the document and doing the doing, she's saying, it's great that you have policy. It's great that you have an anti-racist policy, right? And you're onboarding a teacher and you give them the anti-racist policy and you say, read this, right? But she says that they may never read it. And what happens is this policy becomes what she calls a dead document, right? It's written, possibly by a consultant that comes in to write it for you, and it goes in a filing cabinet and it's maybe pulled out once a year. Okay, and she says, really what we want to be doing is creating lived documents. We want to be creating documents that are alive, that are being added to, that are being collaborated on by everybody, right? Or a group of people, which I also found very interesting. So anyway, habitual worlds, right? So thinking about the ways in which bodies influence the shape and the contours of institutions, the people that walk through the halls create the wider working culture. Really important for us thinking about the diversity within the workforce. It's also really important for us thinking about our student body that's at the school, right? Our senior leadership, right? It makes us think about every single person that's coming into these environments, and also makes us think about how we might want to change and shift these environments by just shifting our daily habits whilst we're in these environments. And of course, in many ways, bringing a more diverse people into these environments as well. So you've heard me say a few times racial literacy, and I did mention racial literacy in the last session. I thought, you know what, let's give a firm definition, something you can have, that you can stick your teeth into. And so this is from the Runnymede Trust in 2020, a research organization. And the Runnymede Trust says, in the context of schooling, racial literacy refers to the capacity of teachers to understand the ways in which race and racism work in society. It also involves having the language, skills, and confidence to utilize that knowledge in teacher practice. Focusing on racial literacy means that issues pertaining to race and racism become the responsibility of all teachers. Okay? It's really, really great, and it equips you with the skills to be able to have these conversations with your students. Really, really important. As I said in the last session, your students are also very much aware of these things and have this knowledge is there. Being able to have these conversations with them is really important. So I want to introduce you to a quick concept now, intersectionality. Okay, intersectionality was developed by the scholar and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. Okay, and she coined this in 1989 when she was doing some work essentially she was doing some work for women that were victims of domestic violence. And she found that there was race impacted how and when women receive justice for racial violence. Okay, so she said to herself, well, actually, being a woman doesn't necessarily mean that you will always receive justice, right? When you are experiencing racial violence. Sorry, when you're experiencing gender-based violence. And so what she found was that Black women were less likely to receive the justice and the protection of the courts when they were experiencing gender-based violence than their white female counterparts. So she said, well, I want to go in and I want to look at this in more detail. And it's an incredibly dense concept as well. It doesn't just, there's multiple iterations of intersectionality. It doesn't just fall with it under race, but this was the example or what she was seeing when she was doing her own research. And she developed the term intersectionality, which was to say that essentially, when you come from different groups, right? When their personal characteristics of a certain person intersect with some people, sorry, I'll start that again. When the personal characteristics intersect, some people experience loaded advantage and others loaded disadvantage. So really what she was saying was that for the Black woman, they were experiencing both racism and gender-based discrimination within the court, which meant that they didn't receive the same justice as somebody that was solely experiencing gender-based discrimination within that court system. And so she said that these disadvantages compound together to create an intersectional experience, right? That's not more than or less than, but different than their white female counterparts. Okay, so we can think about that in terms of loaded advantage and loaded disadvantage. So I have a very quick video here that I'm going to play for you. I'm thinking about the way in which intersectionality kind of comes together. If you were to think of it as a way in which the identity of one person, right, whether they, let's say the identity of one Black person, Black woman, as I said before, experiences discrimination versus the identity of one, let's say a white woman experiences discrimination. Now, the white woman may experience various forms of gender-based discrimination. The Black woman will experience various forms of gender-based discrimination and racial discrimination, right? Therefore, their experience of discrimination is different, right? And even though they can talk about gender-based discrimination, they can't talk about race-based discrimination, right? Which means that when you're designing your policies, you have to be aware in which the ways in which race and racism and gender and discrimination around disabilities and so on and so forth can come together to create very unique experiences of discrimination within the classroom environment, within the wider school culture, that may otherwise not be understood or seen when you're solely going through a lens of gender, solely going through a lens of race, solely going through a lens of disability. Right? You have to also marry them together to understand the ways in which they come together to create the unique experience of discrimination within a given setting.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
So we're coming to the last few slides now, the last section of today's session, which is building an action plan. So what would success look like? Okay, what would success look like? For everybody here, success looks like holding our leaders to account for our racial literacy provision. I know everybody on this course is also a senior leader, right? So it's also thinking about how can you hold one another responsible? How can you hold the rest of your leadership team responsible, okay, for a racial literacy provision? And as I mentioned in the last session, that doesn't mean that one person is doing it, right? The weight needs to be shared, okay? Very, very easy, very, very quick to burn out within this kind of work, okay? So it needs to be shared, it needs to be sustained, it needs to be consistent, okay? Empowering everyone to relentlessly challenge inappropriate behaviors. That doesn't necessarily need to be in public, that can also be pulling people aside, having a conversation with them, right? Doesn't need to be in the moment of I'm going to say this right in front of everybody, right? We also want to come with compassion. We want to be sensitive to other people. We want to be sensitive not to provoke shame in other people, right? Because ultimately we want to see a change. And when you shame somebody, you'll get a defensive reaction right away. Okay, but ultimately we want to relentlessly challenge inappropriate behaviors in the setting that will produce the best possible outcome. Supporting each member of staff and each student to take individual responsibility for their bias, whether conscious or unconscious, intersectional empathy, which comes back to, as I was saying before, and racial literacy, okay? So how do we measure it? Okay, so if we're trying to measure the impact that our anti-racist action plan has had, we might see an increased percentage of people who feel confident in discussing race and racism. We also might see an increase of people who feel confident in challenging racially illiterate behavior. Okay? Because confidence equals safe, informed, and supported students. And also the levels for students furthest behind academically and most at risk of being left behind for attendance, well-being, behavior, and achievement, that gap might slowly close. Okay, that gap might slowly close because ultimately those students that are being left behind further, there may be intersectional reasons for them being left behind. Okay, so as you kind of go through building your anti-racist and intersectional action plan, right, hopefully you'll slowly see this gap closing, okay? So how will we measure it? So an increase in student and staff perceptions of intersectional academic emphasis. So our school places strong emphasis on the importance of academic success for all students, irrespective of their background. We contribute, so students see their opportunities to contribute to social life and improvement as authentic and meaningful. And instructional leadership. So our leadership team is directly involved in the design, implementation, and monitoring of racial literacy, instruction, support, and assessment, as well as an intersectional framework there. Another way you might think about intersectionality is what happens with learning disabilities. Okay, so it's been widely reported that young black men who are also autistic, when they have autistic burnouts, when they have autistic meltdowns, those autistic meltdowns are often read as being boisterous, as being challenging, and as being confrontational, rather than being symptomatic of overwhelm, right? Rather than being the body's response to going through a period of intense stress and overwhelm, and the meltdown being an exteriorization of that intense stress, that intense anxiety, and that intense overwhelm. So when we think about intersectionality in this way, what we see is that even though, let's say, even though this young black individual, this young black male is autistic and black, when they have a meltdown, that meltdown is seen as a behavioral issue, right, rather than a support issue. It's another example of intersectionality right there as well. And of course, within a school setting, what does that look like? That looks like them being excluded internally, possibly permanently, having to go from school to school, maybe having to go to a pupils referral unit, right? And essentially losing their pathway within education or struggling intensely within education. So how else will we measure it? So we might see a decrease in survey of students selecting no or prefer not to say, okay? Numbers of discrimination based on complaints and grievances may rise or may decrease, right? It's very normal. It's very normal to see the number of these things increase initially at first, and that's because all of a sudden people have a language to put it to, right? They're able to identify something because they've learned about something in more detail. So it's very normal maybe to see that rise, increase in the beginning, and then slowly see it decrease after that kind of equilibrium has been found, okay? Numbers of discrimination-based incidents, including bullying and harassment, may decrease. Again, as I said, may rise initially at first because people are becoming more empowered to call it out, more empowered to challenge this kind of behavior. So you might see an increase, and then slowly, as more and more people get to understand and kind of, let's say, integrate an anti-racist action or an anti-racist standpoint of life, that will slowly decrease. So not to worry if you do see a slow increase or an increase in these behaviors first and foremost. And disproportionate percentages of attendance, behavior, achievement outcomes, recruitment, retention, and career pathways, and performance management outcomes. Bit of a mouthful. But yeah, so seeing that, seeing those disproportionate percentages for all of these things here may gradually decrease because the various reasons as to why some of these students aren't engaging, recruitment, retention, etc., will slowly decrease as well, okay? So ultimately, what can we take away from this, okay? What can we take away from this? I think if there's one thing we can take away from this section here on building an action plan and thinking around intersectionality, is essentially thinking about the ways in which policy, pedagogy, behavioral management, and the environment, the curriculum, the voice of your students, and yourselves as senior leaders, right? And the voice and agency of students, attendance and attainment all come together. They all coalesce together in many ways, right? To create a greater sense of progress and a greater sense of well-being, okay? They all intersect. And so really when you're doing this anti-racist business plan, this anti-racist action plan, what you end up seeing is as they come together, right, as you're building this plan, you're seeing an increase in people feeling safer and more comfortable, right? But also you're creating more opportunities to assess and investigate these separate things such as policy, pedagogy, so on and so forth. So what we would say is please, definitely create an intersectional analysis of some of these things that we have here on the left-hand side, whether that be quantitative or qualitative data, right? So numbers or language. And that can provide effective means of listening, understanding, and responding to groups within your immediate school, within your immediate schooling environment, who are underrepresented or disadvantaged, right? When you have that analysis, you can then think about the action plan that you're going to create, okay? So this data then informs smart objectives, as I mentioned before, right? That you really have, they're there. You can bring them to your next senior leadership meeting, and you can begin to implement them, okay? They will ultimately be designed to support and sustain anti-racist action, as well as building the trust for your wider community, right? And when I say wider community, I mean obviously the parents and carers that are coming into the school, and also the wider school community in general. Okay, so I hope that you found.
If you would like to continue your anti-racist professional learning journey with DARPL, please consider joining our Enhanced Leadership series. This is a series of 6 professional learning days with a combination of in-person and virtual learning. We run 2 cohorts each academic year, with cohorts in North and South Wales each time. To register, please click the link on the slide or visit the DARPL website for more information. If you would like continued support and guidance for your learning organisation, please consider joining the DARPL Advocacy Network. Each associated learning organisation is able to request bespoke professional learning which can be linked to their school improvement or development plans to support them to become anti-racist learning organisations. For more information on becoming a DAN school, please click the link and complete the inquiry form.
Today useful, and I hope that you've come away with some things written down that you can revisit, that you can reflect on in a little bit more detail, and hopefully bring into some meetings, right? Hopefully bring into some meetings. I think the main takeaway from this is support one another, critically assess, not just from an anti-racist standpoint, but also from an intersectional standpoint, and really build that action plan, right? But thinking back to Sarah Ahmed's work, also focus on the doing, okay? It's great to have an action plan, really, really important, but balance it out with the doing as well. So with all that being said, I'll just say thank you very much, everybody. I hope today was useful, and hope to see you in person at another DARPL event. Thank you. Bye-bye.